Mary Pat Higgins, who is the President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Mary Pat?
Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, as Annie said, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual panel discussion. I'd like to start by acknowledging everyone who is hurting right now in our community, across the United States, and around the world. We see you and we hear you. The mission of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum is to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. The tragic and unnecessary deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and too many other incidents of racial bias and inequity make it clear that our mission is not yet fulfilled. Our commitment to advancing human rights is more important than ever. Those of you who visited the museum, which we hope to be able to safely reopen soon, know that the focus of the final wing of our permanent exhibition focuses on the struggle in America for equal civil and human rights by various groups. We celebrate the inspirational ideals upon which our country was founded, but we challenge our visitors to acknowledge that we have not always lived up to those ideals, and they have not been uniformly enjoyed by all our citizens. Finally, we hope to inspire our visitors to participate in the process of repair, to follow in the footsteps of inspirational upstanders who saw something wrong and worked to make it right. To overcome the systemic and institutional racism that is endemic throughout our country, we must all participate in the process of repair. We must work together to combat racial bias and injustice. We certainly don't have all the answers, but we know from studying history that great change is possible when people stand up and work together. One such change we highlight in our American Ideals Wing is the passage of the 19th Amendment, thanks to the tireless work of the women's suffrage movement, giving women the right to vote. I'd like to thank the 19th Amendment of tonight's event. I'd also like to thank our community partners for this evening, the Anti-Defamation League, Texoma, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Greater Dallas, Congregation Anshe Torah, Denton Black Film Festival, Legacy Senior Communities, SMU Human Rights Program, Wings, and World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our museum members joining us this evening. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And finally, a big thank you and welcome to our board members who have been so supportive to our team. I know several of you are tuning in tonight. Thank you. Tonight, we are pleased to present a conversation around women's suffrage in the United States as part of our permanent exhibition highlight series. This program was originally going to take place in person at the museum in March, but was postponed due to concerns around COVID-19. I sincerely appreciate our speakers for being so flexible and working with us to present this program virtually this evening. Our panelists are Dr. Charisse Jones-Branch, the Vaughn Endowed Professor of History at Arkansas State University. Dr. Jones-Branch is the author of Crossing the Line, Women's Interracial Activism in South Carolina During and After World War II, and is co-editor of Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times. Her current research project is Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Rural Black Women's Activism in Arkansas, 1913 to 1965. Dr. Cynthia E. Orozco, Professor of History and Humanities at Eastern New Mexico University, Ruidoso, is the author of No Mexicans, Women or Dogs Allowed, The Rise of the American Civil Rights Movement and Agent of Change, Adela Slas-Vento, Mexican-American civil rights activist and Texas feminist. Dr. Orozco is a founder of the Chicana Caucus of the National Association for Chicano Studies and a national board member of Unladylike 2020, a multimedia project celebrating women of the progressive era in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And Dr. Lisa Tatro is an associate professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University, specializing in the history of U.S. women and gender. She is the author of The Myth of Seneca Falls, Memory and the Women's Suffrage Movement, 1848 to 1898, and is currently working on a book titled Interwoman Suffrage, A Wholly New History of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1878. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Krista DeLuzio, Associate Professor of History and the Altshuler Distinguished Teaching Professor at Southern Methodist University, right here in Dallas. She is the editor of Women's Rights, People and Perspectives, co-editor of On the Borders of Love and Power, Families and Kinship in the Intercultural American West, and author of Female Adolescence in American Scientific Thought, 1830 to 1930. As Annie mentioned, we will leave time for questions at the end of the discussion. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type it out and submit it. Now, please welcome our panel for this evening.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Mary Pat. And on behalf of the panelists, thanks to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for hosting us tonight. It is my great pleasure to serve as moderator of this panel discussion this evening. The topic of our discussion is women of color and the long and ongoing fight for equal voting rights and for equality more broadly in the United States. This is a big topic, and we know that we will only be able to cover some of the experiences of women of color in the course of the discussion. With the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment approaching in August, it is our hope that this discussion will challenge some of what we thought we knew, or perhaps a lot of what we thought we knew, about, quote, the women's suffrage movement, and especially that it will encourage us to think in new ways about the vital role of women of color in creating and furthering the development of democracy in the United States. Before delving into some specific questions on these themes, I'd like to first invite each of our panelists to tell us a bit about their contributions to the historical scholarship on suffrage, on women of color and voting rights, and on women of color and freedom and social justice movements more broadly. And so we will begin with Charisse.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I'm sad that I didn't get to see the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, but I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk with folks from the Dallas area and the folks representing the museum. In terms of my scholarship, I, in the past few years, have focused quite a bit on agricultural history, the rural activism of Black women, and my forthcoming book, in fact, is on rural Black women in Arkansas between 1913 and about 1965. And in that book, I talk about not only rural Black women who were agricultural laborers, but I expand the narrative to talk about who and what women were outside of their working hours, and to also emphasize the fact that rural Black women activists were not always agricultural laborers. Some of these women were Jeans industrial supervising teachers. Some of these women were home demonstration agents who were employed by the Arkansas Agricultural Cooperative Extension Service. Some of these women, almost all of them, particularly if they were middle class and educated, were members of the Arkansas Association of Colored Women. That's important to suffrage because all throughout the 20th century, people aren't really focusing on what rural Black women are doing, except to understand them in this very limited way. But suffrage was one of many issues that concern rural Black women. So in their work in these spaces, they're concerned about taking care of homes, improving the quality of farm life, things like that. But suffrage is part and parcel of those discussions. And so that's what my forthcoming work is focusing on. Thank you.
Yes, I have written a book called No Mexicans, Women or Dogs Allowed, The Rise of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, which is a history of the origins of the LULAC organization, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the oldest major Latino civil rights organization in the country. There we see that Mexican American men had suffrage after, of course, the 1840s. But we also see that they had box politics. The poll tax was in effect. There was a white primary in some counties and no Tejano men in the state legislature. We also see that LULAC started as a male organization, and then when women were allowed around 1931, all the chapters were gender segregated, mostly up until the 1970s. My second book is on Adela Slas Bento of San Juan in Edinburgh, Texas, and she benefited from women's suffrage of 1920 and came to fruition really in the 1920s. She was part of that progressive effort and was active from 1927 to 1990. She was an advocate for women to vote. She was an advocate for women to be involved in civic participation, and also for women to pay the poll tax.
Thank you, Cynthia. Lisa?
Lisa, you're muted.
The rookie Zoom mistake. And I thought to myself, make sure I don't make that mistake. And of course I do it out the gate. Hello, everyone. I too am sorry not to be with you at the Dallas Holocaust Museum, but thank you to them for hosting us. And I'm glad that we could nonetheless have this important discussion in this format. I am a historian of race, gender, and democracy, and I'm particularly interested in how we tell stories, particularly historical stories, and what the narratives are meant to convey in terms of moral lessons. And my first book was about the trouble of the story of Seneca Falls, which, as we'll talk about in a minute, is often used to pinpoint the beginning of women's rights in the United States or the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. That's a deeply problematic and troubled narrative, and I tried to write a history of that story, not of the event, but of the story around that event, which has become quite canonical. And although in the intro it mentioned that I was working on a book about Reconstruction women's suffrage, I've since abandoned that, or at least put it aside, because the anniversary has been so interesting to me in terms of all of the stories we tell around 1920 that also aren't particularly useful. So I'm now writing a book about the 19th Amendment, not the winning of the 19th Amendment, but around the different kind of ways in which we narrate around the 19th Amendment and the different difficulties in terms of understanding the operations and the limits and the function of American democracy and how we do that. Called the Celebrated but Misunderstood Amendment. And I hope that much of what we'll talk about today is the limitations of the stories that we have, particularly how those stories have excised the histories of women of color. So.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. So I do want to just continue with that. And so if I could raise the first question about, if we could frame for us, I'm going to ask Lisa for you to start us off here, about this conventional or traditional narrative of women's suffrage, some of which perhaps many audience members are familiar with that. But then especially we want to focus on why that narrative is not particularly helpful when we want to start to think through the activism of women of color. And I'll ask Cynthia and Charisse to join in on both parts of that.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have a great deal to say about this. So the conventional story goes something like this, and many people probably know it. Women met for the first time in Seneca Falls, New York, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Oftentimes people put Susan B. Anthony there, although she was not there. In Seneca Falls, New York, and held the first women's rights convention in the nation, launched a women's suffrage movement, launched a women's rights movement. People often use those interchangeably. Made the first demand for the vote, which they did demand the vote. It was not the first demand for the vote, but it's often said to be that. It's often said to be true. And then that movement marched forward, meeting many defeats and many setbacks, and finally roughly 75 to 100 years later, succeeded in triumph with the ratification and the passage of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which supposedly gave women the right to vote, which a demand that had originated at Seneca Falls in 1848. That narrative is largely being dismantled right now by historians and by scholars and by activists. And one of the great things I think about the anniversary has been all of the ways that people have been trying to come up with new narratives that don't follow the 1848 to 1920 story. That 1848 to 1920 story is largely a history of white women's activism, and often white middle-class women's activism, and often the pursuit of a voting right that would largely benefit white women, and often left out and was willing to make compromises with white supremacy and the exclusion of women of color. And for all kinds of reasons, that narrative is fictitious, unhelpful. The things said about it are often not true. I hope one of the things we talk about today is that the 1920 women did not win the right to vote in 1920. That's not what the 19th Amendment did at all. And that we don't actually know what the 19th Amendment did has become a source of great interest to me over the course of the centennial. And let me just say one more thing about that, at 1848, there were no women of color at Seneca Falls that we know of. They may have been there. We don't know all the people that were there. But there were plenty of women of color organizing around their own rights. Seneca Falls was not, white women didn't originate this idea. White women didn't, were the ones who sort of came up with it and modeled it. This is something that already existed prior to that. And so also the organizing that then moves forward often is so accommodating of white supremacy that women of color often choose to organize in other places and other venues and in other ways, both leading up to 1920 and after 1920. So one of the faults, I think, of what some of the recovery work around race that people are trying to do in the centennial has been to try to locate the women of color in that white organizing. That largely white organizing. And that's a super important project and it needs to happen. But as long as we allow that narrative of 1848 to 1920 to be the story and the movement, we continue to participate in a project of exclusion by not realizing that there are many other histories and many other stories that we need to recover and bring into the larger narrative. And that's much of what a lot of people have been doing. And oftentimes women of color are organizing on their own terms, and we don't find that activism in the 1848 to 1920 narrative. And so it's really important that one of the things we realize is that we're operating with a story that is itself whitewashed and problematic. So I'll end there, and I'm sure Cynthia and Charisse have a lot to say about that particular topic.
Yeah, I quite agree with all of that. The narrative has been extremely limited, and in a similar vein, when Black women do come up or women of color do come up, those are often middle upper class women as well. So you're talking about your Mary Church Terrells, your Ida B. Wells Barnetts, and individuals like that. Those are middle class, relatively nationally known women. What the story doesn't get to the heart of is women's organizing efforts on a local level, which is a lot of what I talk about in my work. And they're worked through such organizations as the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896, and one of its primary objectives was women's suffrage. And a lot of people don't really think about this. They think of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as the primary civil rights organization, but the NACW came first. And a lot of these women's clubs, federated Black women's clubs all around the nation, if you look at the founding dates, virtually all of them were founded before the NAACP. And if you look at their founding papers, their documents, their reason for being, what have you, they almost always mention suffrage. So that's a hot button issue for them from the very beginning. But if you're focusing on a national story, you miss the complexities and the nuances of what women of color are doing on the ground in their own communities, and the very special and unique ways that they have to support suffrage efforts. Because if you're talking about Black women down in the rural South, to be public and vocal about supporting women's suffrage is the kind of thing that could get one seriously harmed. So they have to think very cleverly and very strategically about how to push these initiatives. So what they have to understand is where they are, who they're dealing with, and they have to, I think, know intuitively how to gauge and navigate that space so that they can help people understand that they have the right to access full citizenship. But that's easier said than done when you're in the rural South, particularly in the early 20th century, where people are being killed for the slightest racial transgression. And voting, attempting to exercise the right to vote, is probably one of the biggest transgressions of them all.
I guess I'd like to add to that. I guess I could start by saying that we really have, to my knowledge, no book or major article about Latinas and women's suffrage. If you look at the Latina Historical Encyclopedia, for example, there is no entry on women's suffrage. Again, we are a very, very diverse community. Latinos encompass many different nationalities and ethnic groups: Spanish, Mexican, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, etc. Puerto Ricans, we should recall, do not become U.S. citizens until 1917. Nonetheless, we had people like Luisa Capitio from New York, who was a communist and socialist, and who was active as a suffrage in the cigar factories. Also, amongst the Cuban community, we have lesbian Mercedes de Acosta, who is a writer from New York. Most of what I'm going to talk about, however, is going to focus on the Mexican descent community, particularly in Texas. And one of the things that we also should consider is that women's Mexican descent's struggle for suffrage is mostly, before the 1920s, a struggle for male suffrage, because we know that they are involved in a transnational or transborder political struggles. We should recall that Porfirio Diaz is the president of Mexico from the 1870s to 1910. He becomes a dictator and does not permit elections. So much of women's activism in Texas is with the PLM, the Partido Liberal Mexicano, the Liberal Mexican Party, in the early 1900s and 1910s in both the United States and Mexico. And the pressing political issue is to get rid of the dictator and to be involved in the revolutionary politics of Mexico with much less attention to the United States. And really, we should also consider that not only are Mexican and Mexican-American women dealing with the sexism in the United States, but Mexico itself does not pass women's suffrage till the 1950s. So we also have that sexism and machismo coming from another country as well.
Well, thank you very much. I think I want to build a little bit off of more on what you've just said. Maybe if we could hear a little bit more about the ways in which women of color empowered themselves. And again, in some ways, because we're trying to push beyond boundaries, it's hard to know how to frame it. But within suffrage movements, within women's rights movements, within women's movements maybe more broadly, I guess I'm also very interested in the relationship, right? Charisse, you mentioned about how the vote was absolutely a critical tool in terms of a much broader based agenda. And then I think there's a lot of ideas here, but as a historian of ideas and intellectual historian and a historian of science and ideas, I'm also interested to know how women of color thought about the vote and talked about it. And I'm thinking, of course, again, in the context of the mainstream movement, we think about the women who talked about it as an individual right. We think about the women who talked about it in terms of gender difference. What about women of color and the ways in which they conceptualized and thought about it, and then sought to integrate that in their various forms of activism that you have begun to mention? So there's a lot there on the table, but pick up on any of that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, so Black women are often very interested in the vote for their families, And they too are dealing, with sexism. I mean, everybody's being informed by these ideas about, patriarchy and sexism. Nobody escapes that. But, Black women are very interested in what this can do for their families and for their communities. Because if you think about the National Association of Colored Women, the motto of the organization is lifting as we climb. Right? So it's not just about men getting the right to vote. It's about understanding that because of the very intense racial violence, women are often the ones who have to become the vanguard for all of this. Women are the ones who are pushing for these initiatives so that they can protect and improve conditions in Black communities. So like some of the work that I do on Arkansas with Black women who are members of the Arkansas Association of Colored Women, yes, they want the right to vote, which by the way, women in Arkansas get the right to vote in 1917, right? Which still doesn't do a whole lot, for Black women, but women get the right to vote in this state earlier. But this is important to Black women because they want access to the governor. And another thing that I want to point out is that even when they cannot vote, that doesn't mean that they don't wield political power, however limited it is. Because when they're pushing for these kinds of initiatives, and I think Black Club women across the nation want things like industrial homes for Black boys and girls, because when they are convicted often of petty crimes, they're sent to jail with hardened criminals. And so in Arkansas, I know I have the documentation, they're directly appealing to the governor to say, look, the next time the state legislature meets, we need to appropriate money for these kinds of these homes so that we can protect these young Black people. So as I said before, this is embedded in a whole host of other concerns. It's not just women's suffrage. That's not the single standing issue for them. It's all of these other issues. How are we going to save Black men and Black people generally from, racial violence? How are we going to protect Black children? How are we going to improve Black homes and communities so that we can potentially access the benefits of full citizenship? And for some of them, the politics of respectability matter here as well. For some of them, they're very much interested in uplifting Black communities so that they will eventually become acceptable to white people. So all of this is part and parcel of the discussion about the reasons why suffrage is so important. And I also want to say this, it's not to say that they don't talk about women's suffrage, they do. One of the women I write about in my forthcoming book, her name was Mamie Stewart, Yolsenberger, who was from New York, but she lived her entire life in Fort Smith, Arkansas, graduated from Fisk University in the same class as W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And so when she graduates from Fisk University in 1888, again, with W.E.B. Du Bois, she gives us a lecture as part of the commencement exercises on basically the reasons why women ought to have the right to vote. So, to the point that Lisa made earlier, this has been a long and protracted discussion for Black women.
I guess I would want to say that it is important to understand that language also is a major factor in Latina or particularly Mexican Americans' participation in the suffrage movement, not to mention the racism that is so common in this time period. In 1918 in Texas, for example, there are 98 women's suffrage organizations. To my knowledge, none of them are organized or for women of Mexican descent. So one of the ways that Mexican descent women empower themselves is staying away from white women, because they will be insulted and they are excluded. I know there was an attempt by the Women's Christian Temperance Union to include African American women, but there never was a specific division that was oriented toward the Mexican descent community. However, we are in our own ethnic organizations. We have, since the 1860s, mutual aid societies. We also have major anti-lynching campaigns, particularly in the 1910s in Texas. We are also subject to the same kind of racial violence that African Americans are experiencing. And so Latinas and Mexican American women particularly really do not have some of the same things that are beneficial to African American women. We do not have colleges for Mexican descent people. We don't have a national organization of women probably until the 1970s. We don't have a corpus of teachers that can serve as major organizers. So really, the efforts that we see are primarily local women, mostly teachers, middle-class teachers, middle-class writers or journalists, and or socialist women who are active in journalism in the 1910s and 20s that can advocate for their community.
So on that point that Cynthia just made about language, I want to point out that every time we use the word women's suffrage, we're definitely talking about the kind of 1848 to 1920 narrative. And one of the things that's happening around the anniversary is I think that term is getting expanded to the question of voting rights. And if we think about that, it's a much broader history for all sorts of women than it is the suffrage movement. And whenever we talk about the suffrage movement, sort of we're really prioritizing a kind of white women's activism whereby 1920 was a really significant date in terms of removing the one obstacle that many white women faced, which was gender. But many other people faced other obstacles to voting, such that the removal of gender was not a sufficient removal, or they didn't have, in the case of many folks, they didn't have citizenship, or they didn't have some of their other requirements that were there for voting. And it might be useful right now to think about the ways in which the United States actually structures voting, because I think this bears upon where and how we find activism by women who were non-white. And oftentimes this is in league with men, right? Because they don't have the privilege to just emphasize the issue of women's suffrage, because there are so many other issues, as both Charisse and Cynthia just highlighted, that there isn't this kind of elevation of that to the fore and the primary goal in a way that it makes it harder to see in some cases, particularly because we've focused on people who just identify as woman suffragists, as that's the story. And so I do think that shift in language, which a lot of people during the centennial have been talking about, is a super important one in terms of increasing visibility and realizing that women's suffrage is only a small part of the overall fight for women to gain access to voting. In terms of the question you asked, Krista, about how do women of color understand voting, there have been some brilliant answers here. And there's also the great work of Elsa Barkley Brown, which has large informed many ways in which people try to distinguish between how, after the American Civil War, when white suffragists begin to start demanding a constitutional amendment, how very different communities of color understand women and voting in a way that she argues that there's a sense among white folks that this is an individual possession, whereas among freed people and others, there's a sense that the vote is a community possession to be used for, in the language that Charisse reminds us of, is lifting as we climb. And that black women, she argues, in many ways, did exercise voting after the American Civil War, but they exercised it by influencing how black men would cast their votes, that there would be a community meeting and a community discussion about how were these community votes going to be cast that black men had access to. So she's also talked again about how this wasn't necessarily about just individual rights, which is often the ways that we frame a kind of white narrative around suffrage, but very much about uplifting a community. And the degree to which that continued to be a really strong vein, at least in African-American women's activism, that this was about not just individual empowerment, which was often the way it was narrated for white women, but this was about communal improvement.
Thank you very much. We can certainly say more about racial divisions, other kinds of divisions, but I do want to ask, and I'm thinking, Charisse, of your work, maybe to get started, about interracial cooperation. Are there stories to be told there, pre-1920, post-1920? What can we highlight about that?
There are always stories to be told. The question is, of course, the issue, the problem, I suppose, is that those stories are fraught with all kinds of tensions, right? And so, we have to acknowledge that, and we have to acknowledge that in a certain time and period. Again, I think, like Lisa said, when women meant white women, and white women often led with that identity before anything else. So anyone who might be anatomically female is still somehow less of a woman if they aren't a white woman. But that's not to say that there isn't interracial activism, but it is the kind of interracial activism that I think leaves Black women often very tired and exhausted, because they have to continually navigate these racial minefields. But they're also smart, right? Because they understand who has access to the levers of power. So they always have to be thinking about the ways to navigate and maneuver through these relationships in hopes of getting access to whatever they need for their community. So, if I'm talking specifically about what Black women are doing in Arkansas, during World War I, on the eve of the 19th Amendment, they're working very closely with Black women through the Red Cross, although in segregated situations, but they're communicating with these women as much as they can, because they understand that the woman who's in charge of the Red Cross or food preservation or whatever for the state is related to the governor. So, they understand the channels through which they have to maneuver in hopes of obtaining access to political power, if not quite the vote. But ultimately, the vote is what they want.
Cynthia or Lisa, would you like to take up this question?
Yes, is this the question about how women of color reckon with racism? Is this?
Well, certainly it's related. You can sort of come at it from either angle.
Okay.
So that one, and or I'm interested in this idea of, I don't know if cooperation is the right word, intersection.
Okay, well, all right. So let me first deal with that question of racism. One thing we do have to remember about the U.S. and specifically Texas is there's a long history of anti-Spanish sentiment dating back to conflict between Spain and England. In addition, of course, we had the Texas Revolution of 1836, which created almost a permanent anti-Mexican sentiment in Texas. We also had the Spanish-American War of 1898, which added even more fuel to that. Beginning in the 1910s, we particularly see greater patterns of racial segregation, particularly in the schools as well as in neighborhoods. So really, there's a long history of people, white people in Texas, not wanting to have any physical proximity to people of Mexican descent. You add also the inferior nature of our schools. Again, we don't have compulsory education in the U.S. until the 1910s. Inferior schools in many places in Texas, especially for the Mexican descent community. So all of these things help to create racial barriers for women, Mexican descent women, to participate fully in the broader dominant society. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just point out really quickly that white women were repeatedly willing and repeatedly did throw women of color under the bus. I mean, over and over and over and over again, women of color and men of color. So there was little defense of the disenfranchisement that was going on with Black men over the 1890s and 1910s. Little allyship with women of color who still could not vote after 1920. White organizations would just say, we're sorry, our fight's done. Your fight is yours, not ours. So I just wanted to underscore the degree to which white women were complicit with and participants and creators and enforcers of a kind of racial regime that speaks to the kind of exhaustion that Charisse was talking about. And I do think it's helpful for us to think about, a lot of people are like, oh, then we have to throw these women out, these kind of white suffragists. And I think one of the things that it's helpful for us to think about is the ways in which white supremacy and racism creeps into supposedly progressive organizations and progressive activism. In many ways, one of the things the suffrage movement allows us to do is think about a laboratory whereby supposedly progressive activism can still be highly complicit with and highly creating of white supremacy. And I think that that is an important lesson, less than, oh, these women are horrible, therefore we should throw them out. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't pass some historical judgment, but I don't think we should expect our heroes to be either all good or all bad. People are complex, and I think one of the things that the white suffragists anyway remind us of is that that people are complex, and that complexity matters a lot for how we interrogate ourselves in the present.
Right. I just want to say also that, you know, we do need to expand these narratives. And one of the things that I firmly believe is that we shouldn't think about women of color in the suffrage narrative as being victims. I think we need to be thinking of them as women who empowered themselves. You know, Black women knew, particularly in the rural South, that it would be difficult, if not impossible, for them to exercise the right to vote. But if you think about, for example, when I write about home demonstration agents, they talked about it in home demonstration meetings. That's political activism, right? So they understood that in that particular context, going and trying to exercise the right to vote in 1920 Arkansas might get you killed. But when you are in your private meetings, you can discuss whatever you want. So that knowledge is available for those women who may not ever be able to exercise the right to vote, but it's certainly there for them to pass on to the next generation. And I think it's also important for us to look for political power and political activism in spaces where we tend not to think it exists. Because if you say the Arkansas Agricultural Extension Service and home demonstration agents in Arkansas, people think, oh, they can tomatoes. Tomatoes ain't all that interesting. So other conversations are happening. And also, and this is something that I learned from a colleague of mine, rurality doesn't equal ignorance. Or rather, don't equate rurality with ignorance. Yes, they may be canning tomatoes, and perhaps they even pick cotton all day if you're down in the Arkansas Delta, but that does not mean that they are unintelligent or unaware of important political issues and that they're not discussing them with each other.
I might also add that we do know the names of a few exceptional or elite women that did participate with European American women. We know of a woman named Selena Solomon, who was of Spanish Jewish descent in San Francisco, that in 1910 worked with a group called the Vote for Women Club. Also in Los Angeles, there was a woman named Maria Lopez, who was married to a European American, who was active with the Los Angeles Political Equality League and did very important translation work. Again, you would think that perhaps throughout different states, materials had to be translated or could have been translated in Spanish. And most people who were active in that, we really have little information about. At the same time, let me say that New Mexico is a very unique experience. There, in, let's say, the 1910s, Hispanics are very large in number. In fact, when the state constitution was written in 1912, 1/3 of the people who wrote that constitution were Hispano men, whereas in Texas, there were 3 men who helped, 3 Mexican descent men who helped to write that constitution. So the Hispano population is very active and dominant here. So therefore, we know that Adelina Otero Warren did have relations with the Congressional Union, and she was active with Alice Paul, of course, who is a nationally known figure. And in the 1920s, she runs for Congress. She's the first Latina to run for Congress in the 1920s. Okay, so again, the difference between New Mexico and other places in the Southwest are quite stark. So the Hispanic women's engagement in New Mexico is completely different.
Yeah, one of the things that your comments remind me of, Cynthia, is the ways in which, for many people, fights were not contained within national boundaries, which is one of the ways we tend to talk about voting rights, you know, as a kind of national discussion. And I'm thinking here of Catherine Marino's recent book, Feminism for the Americas, in which she discussed a kind of Pan-American suffrage fight and women's rights fight, again, in which suffrage was embedded but not elevated necessarily to the and looking at the ways in which Latina women kind of across the Americas allied with one another and tried to create things, allyships and empowerment that was not necessarily bounded by national barriers.
And let me also add to that, also coming from the South, or rather the Mid-South, what we also have to keep in mind is that the South isn't ubiquitous, right? Arkansas, I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, where the Civil War started. Charleston, South Carolina is a very different place from Arkansas and the Arkansas Delta. Arkansas has an African-American migration story. So when we think about African-Americans moving, we think of them as moving to the north. What people don't know is that 120,000 of them came to Arkansas, all right? So wrap your mind around the idea of Southern born and raised Black people moving to another section of the South, right? So that alone lets you know that there are things that set Arkansas apart. You know, why not go to New York or someplace like that? Why come to another Southern state? Because on some level, and I think this is true to a certain extent, they understood that there were opportunities here that weren't available to them in the South Carolina Lowcountry or, you know, Mississippi or Louisiana. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and as well, that we don't paint the South with this very broad brush, because that's not accurate.
Thank you. So many interesting threads to pull here, but we're running out of time a little bit, and I did want to have a chance to ask a question. If we could just hover over the amendment itself for a minute, and maybe I'd invite you, Lisa, to maybe clarify for our audience what you mean when you say that the 19th Amendment did not give women the right to vote. And then if we could address in a few minutes the post-1920, right, and how we want to think about then if we're totally disrupting the periodization of this story and the continuance, and maybe we need to touch on the significance of the Voting Rights Act, and even perhaps even the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act if we want to get that far. But let's start with the amendment itself, Lisa, and maybe you can help us to understand its meaning, significance, lack thereof for women of color, and or more broadly.
So one of the things people seem to be most surprised about in my talks around the country has been that there is no right to vote. So women didn't win the right to vote because the right to vote doesn't exist. We are one of the only constitutional democracies in the world that does not contain a right to vote inside of its constitution. Our constitution is mute, actually, on the question of citizens voting or on the question of residents voting, and it leaves that regulation up to the states. So one votes according to state law. So states are allowed to appoint voters. So in other words, states determine who is allowed to vote. Well, we think they have to have these 6 qualifications. And that has often been, property holding, race, sex, age, citizenship, a variety of other things. And so states can and have historically abridged voting in all kinds of ways. And that is perfectly legal because there is no right to vote that's being abridged by the states. And we have, as a nation, actually abridged voting far more than we have ever extended voting. We have only operated as a fully functioning democracy with most people voting since the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has only been, roughly 50 years. And of course, the Voting Rights Act has since been gutted by the United States Supreme Court. So what then did the 19th Amendment do? Because we always talk about, well, it gave women the right to vote. It gave all women the right to vote. It gave some women the right to vote. I don't know. What did it do? So what it actually did is said to the states, you may not discriminate on the basis of sex. And it says essentially, you states who still have in your state voter qualifications, because remember, who can vote depends on what state you live in. This is not a federal right that we have that's federally conferred in any way, shape, or form. And the 19th Amendment does not federalize suffrage. What the 19th Amendment does is say to the states, you may not discriminate on the basis of sex. So it wipes out in state constitutions that word male, because many states said that voters had to be male. But there are a number of things about the 19th Amendment that are misleading. And one is that all women started voting in 1920. That's not true. because many states, and here Cynthia has already, or Charisse has already referred to Arkansas in 1917, many states already voluntarily struck the word male as a voter qualification before 1920. In fact, all of the West already had struck the word male from voting qualifications in their state laws prior to 1920. And many other states had allowed women to vote in certain types of elections, like school elections, because, the ladies, they know the school things, but they couldn't vote in other types of elections. So many states had already extended partial suffrage to women. So millions of women are voting before 1920, millions and millions. And it's part of why 1920 goes through, is because millions of women across the country are already voting. Millions of women don't vote after 1920 because they live in states whereby sex is now dropped as a bar, but there are plenty of other obstacles that remain in place in state law. And if you're a white middle-class woman, chances are the only obstacle you had was your sex. And so when your state drops that obstacle, which the 19th Amendment requires if it hadn't already, you can now vote because there's no other obstacle in your way. So the 19th Amendment actually helps all women because it strikes sex, but the problem is in many states, there are other bars, other voting obstacles that still remain. Literacy tests, poll taxes, understanding clauses. And those are not just used across the South against African-American populations, which is the way we tend to think of them. They were used in New Mexico. They were used in New York. And so there was a literacy test in New York, for example. And so this was often used to keep immigrants out of voting, or to keep Latinx folks from voting in, the Southwest, or, and then there was also a citizenship requirement often. And so the fact that we barred many Asian Americans from citizenship and barred Native Americans from citizenship, this meant that many people couldn't access the vote because of citizenship. So the thing is, there's never a positive conferral of a right to vote in United States history, and that is still true. What we have is the United States government saying to the states, you may not discriminate on these grounds, but on all these other grounds, go right ahead. We're not going to regulate those things. And we are in the midst right now, particularly since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 in the Shelby County v. Holder decision. We are in the midst right now of the states ramping up disqualification and voter obstacle efforts. And they are still allowed to do that because we don't have a federal right to vote. So the states are not abridging something. They're not abridging a right. But we speak constantly as a nation about our right to vote, when in fact we don't possess a right to vote. And so that is deeply troubling right now, because the more we reinscribe this idea of a right to vote during the anniversary, the more we blind ourselves to the ways in which the states are currently abridging citizens and folks' access to voting right now. It's estimated that we are in the midst right now of one of the most sweeping phases of voter disenfranchisement and discrimination since pre-1965, pre-Voting Rights Act. And those further obstacles will mean that women of color will continue to fight on different fronts, depending on what their particular obstacle was, to continue to gain access to the vote. And for many women, it's citizenship laws like the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act, or it's the Voting Rights Act, or it's the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in '82, which gives bilingual ballots. It's a whole variety of things that finally give people access to the vote. And what people really get is access, not a positive conferral of a right that cannot be abridged. So,
thank you very much. Charisse, Cynthia, would you like to add to the discussion about especially post-1920 and to leave us with in terms of women of color?
Yeah, I guess I would. I would say that Mexican American women do feel empowered to vote and do vote and pay the poll tax. And of course, the Voting Rights Act really does matter. But really, for us, it's the Chicano movement, and particularly the Mujeres por la Raza with the Raza Unida organization in Texas, that really begins to activate Mexican American women to get active in politics. We don't have our first Tejana state legislature until the mid-'70s with Irma Rangel. So again, voting, of course, is one thing. Getting people that represent your interests is another thing. And just last year, we finally got 2 Latinas into the US Congress from Texas for the very first time. So it's been a very, very slow road for Tejanas and Latinas in Texas.
I would say that one thing, when Lisa was talking about the restrictions, poll taxes, literacy tests, things like that, again, if we're talking about the South, those things aren't the same all across the South, right? A lot of that depends on the size of the Black population. Some of the restrictions were the strictest in places like Mississippi, but not so much in Arkansas. And going forward, moving beyond the suffrage movement, you know, since you were talking about the change in language, in terms of Black women's political access in this state, one thing that people haven't written a lot about that I've stumbled on is that many African Americans in Arkansas, particularly those who were farmers or landowners, were Republicans. And they remained Republicans well into the mid-1970s. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article about an African American woman who's still very much alive. She's in her late 80s, who ran in 1972 for the Arkansas State Senate. And she went to the National Republican Convention, and she spoke at the National Federation of Republican Women. And so she's very much involved in Republican politics. And she is the one, this farm woman, who goes around these rural communities in the late 1960s and early 1970s, trying to get Black people to vote, trying to get them registered to vote. So, you know, again, in terms of understanding that history, we do have to move beyond the 1920s, but even beyond what people would consider the modern civil rights movement, to recognize that there are still people on the ground engaging in this kind of activism. Now, not this woman quite so much, because as I said, she's older, but we cannot overlook the fact or forget that there are people in rural communities who are still beating the roads and knocking on doors, trying to get people to understand how very important it is, especially in these days and times, to register to vote and then, in fact, to do so.
And I want to augment that excellent point that you cannot talk about this in kind of monolithic ways like the South and not, because this all depends on where you live.
Right.
Voting in the United States is super local, right?
Right.
So it also depends. You might live in Mississippi and the registrar in one county might be particularly draconian and the registrar in another might not. And we
Right.
also can't talk in terms of monolith, in terms of women of color didn't vote after 1920, because that's not true either. Many women of color were voting before 1920.
Right.
Ida B. Wells, for example, is voting in municipal elections and organizing women of color in Chicago in 1913,
Right.
when municipal suffrage passes in Chicago. And Black women, she gets Black women organized in the Alpha Suffrage Club and a variety of other things, and they elect some of the first Black alderperson in Chicago's history before 1920. So, and then some women of color are still pursuing voting rights. At 1920, they go and they register and they successfully cast ballots, and they might meet hostility. So there's no monolith of like white women voted and women of color didn't, or the South didn't vote and the North did, or it was so highly localized and so highly variable. And it partly makes it hard, to go back to my opening in terms of how I'm really interested in how we narrate this story. It partly makes it very, very hard to narrate because there's so much local particularity that you can't kind of make sweeping statements about these people won the right then and these people won the right then, because A, they're not winning a right. What they're trying to do is beat the obstacles. And the obstacles is like a game of whack-a-mole. They're coming up kind of everywhere and all the time. And so to figure out how people are beating down the obstacles is such a particular localized story that it makes it very hard to talk about it in this kind of nationalized way. Because we talk about American democracy as this kind of nationalized federal thing, when in fact it's highly, highly localized. And still to this day, on the local level, individual registrars have incredible power to disenfranchise the people in front of them. And it's very, very hard to see because it's so localized and it's so particularized and so sort of on the ground that you can't kind of say like, this one thing is happening. We can see, voter ID laws are, and there are a variety of things that are closing of polling places, consolidation of polling places, which is often meant to sort of shut down polling places in communities of color. And much like the restrictions of the 1890s and the 1930s, and these are meant to sound plausible and reasonable while actually being, super discriminatory. So so I just want to bring, I think that point is so important that Charisse makes, that you cannot talk about this in this kind of monolithic way, because it is just so highly localized. That's the way we operate as a democratic nation. And one of the questions we ought to ask ourselves as citizens is, do we need to move to some federal voting laws whereby we standardize this thing? And if we were to standardize it and create a positive affirmation of a voting right of citizens or whatever unit we want to use, it would be much harder for these local registrars and these other people to create obstacles for people, because they would be abridging a right that they possessed. And right now, as long as you're not abridging the right on the few grounds that the federal government has said you can't do, then you can go ahead and do it.
But I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that people are smart, right? And people are very clever, again, about how they maneuver around and through the system. And that underscores just how incredibly important the right to vote actually is for people of color in particular.
Yeah, and if they weren't spending so much time trying to deny it, you know, then we would know it didn't matter that much, right? So, yeah. But yeah, people have been enormously clever and successful in terms of, fighting that system, so.
I think Annie Black has some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I know this is a lot to cover, and I'm sure we could have this conversation weekly for the whole year and still not get to everything. So, but let's get to some questions from our audience if we can. So one question is, how is new scholarship addressing women of color and voting rights? Have you all seen anything come out recently that's been interesting to see, and is there anything missing at this point?
Yes. Okay, absolutely. Well, first of all, there are a couple of books that came out years ago. Lisa mentioned Elsa Barkley Brown's book, but there's also a book by the late Rosalind Terborg Penn called African American Women in the Struggle to Vote, 1850 to 1920. And also a book by Cynthia Neverton Morton, African American Women and the Vote, 1837 to 1965. So those books are a bit dated, but what's coming out hot off the press in September 2020 is Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality. And that's coming out by Martha S. Jones, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins University. So yeah, people are still talking about this.
And I would say that folks might take a look at the book, recent book by Gabriela Gonzalez called Redeeming La Raza, where she pays significant attention to Jovita Hidalgo from Laredo, who's a journalist and activist and someone who advocated for suffrage. Also, there's a recent book by Phyllis Barragan Getz called Reading, Writing, and Revolution, where she also focuses on a woman named Maria Villarreal from the San Antonio and Laredo area, who is one of these women active with the PLM and active as a teacher. Also, there is a forthcoming on Chicanas in politics, covering the 20th century. And that really will cover the post-1920 story of what happened to Tejanas in politics.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happened in the centennial and in this kind of lead up to the centennial and the aftermath has been that people have started to connect and do deep research into these localized stories, like the kind of work that Charisse is doing and the stuff that Cynthia is talking about. And connect that to this larger fight around women and voting. Whereas before, there was a kind of segmentation in the scholarship. There was suffrage scholarship, and then there was other activism. And I think a lot of people are now using their activism to kind of poke holes in suffrage narrative. I think people have been doing that for a while, but I think it's finally starting to really have a pretty profound effect. And so I think I see a lot of different kinds of work coming out. One are these kind of deep case studies of that locality and that particularity that we desperately need in order to recover these stories. But then also, like the reference to Martha Jones' book, Vanguard, also an effort then to take all that local, deep-rooted, heavily researched stuff and put it into a new story, to undo the 1848 to 1920 story, to give us a new narrative thread. And I think both those kinds of work are going on right now, this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening on the ground, which we need in order to figure out how to tell a kind of generalized story. And I think what's particularly exciting about Martha's that forthcoming work is this effort to provide a new kind of narrative that will get us away from, at least for one piece of the story. There is no one narrative that can tell this whole history, this 1848 to 1920 story, and just how utterly bankrupt that is in terms of understanding the experiences and the stories of women of color.
Yeah. Great, thank you. In a similar vein, actually, one of our audience members asked if the panelists might be able to recommend a reading list. So I'm going to put you all on the spot. If you'd be willing to send me some of your favorite text articles, I'd be happy to compile something and send it out to everyone who's attending tonight. That way they can benefit from all these recommendations. That would be great. One of our audience members had a question about if anyone wants to comment on how Frederick Douglass might have fit into the narrative of the suffrage movement, given his involvement in some of the leaders of the Seneca Falls convention, and if that translated to anything in the community, in the Black community as well.
Does anyone want to take that up? I'm happy to,
I think she's giving you the signal.
Yeah. So yeah, the story of Frederick Douglass is a really fantastic and troubling one, partly because it follows the same sort of things that Cynthia was talking about earlier about a man of color trying to be an ally to the movement and being an ally to the movement and being a staunch defender of women's political access and of men's political access, and then butting up against a bunch of highly discriminatory and racist behavior from white women. And him skillfully navigating that, much in the ways that many of these activists had to, of continuing to support and be present and fight for women's voting access amidst a lot of really discriminatory activity. And the most famous example is the 15th Amendment. So just to go back to the Seneca Falls story, I'll try to keep this brief, but at Seneca Falls, and we don't know of any of women of color there, but one of the men of color there was Frederick Douglass, who was at that point an emerging abolitionist, had started a newspaper up in Rochester, just north of Seneca Falls. He shows up, and when Elizabeth Cady Stanton proposes the vote as one of the things that ought to be in this list of demands at Seneca Falls, it's met with a lot of opposition. And Frederick Douglass gives an impassioned defense of it. And with that, it passes. So he's instrumental in getting the vote in that early women's rights manifesto called the Declaration of Sentiments that's passed at Seneca Falls that has sort of 12 demands in it, the vote being one. But then flash forward to the post-Civil War era, and those same folks are still working in coalition, and they have a new demand after the American Civil War, no longer just abolition, but now the vote for African Americans and women. And when Congress passes the 15th Amendment, which says states cannot discriminate in voting based on race, and it essentially is the amendment we often talk about as giving Black men the right to vote, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony refused to support it. And they break away from the feminist abolitionist coalition. And they particularly get in a really ugly fight with Frederick Douglass. And they say things to him like, no ignorant Black Sambo will vote before educated white womanhood. This is a degradation of my being, So if there's priority, white women definitely go first. And they say really horrible racist things to Frederick Douglass. And he sort of says back, we're in a fight for our lives, right? Because this is vigilante violence all across, particularly the South. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton say, no. And they go on a crusade to try to oppose the 15th Amendment, Black men's voting rights. So this will be a long and fraught history, and they will continue to co-evolve their politics for another couple of decades. But it's, you know, this is just an example of the kinds of things that, you know, Frederick Douglass and others had to navigate as they tried to figure out their own politics in these situations. So.
Well, I actually think we are out of time. Unfortunately, I really appreciate.
Sorry, I went on way too
long.
long.
No, you're fine. You're fine. You're fine. I appreciate all of you so much for being here tonight, and as Mary Pat said, for making the adjustment to virtual as we venture into this territory. So thank you again to you all for joining us. Charisse, did you want to add? I saw a disappointed face. Did you want to add something before we?
We were having so much fun.
I know. We'll have to do a reunion talk at some point later in the year. But thank you all again. We really appreciate it. For all of our audience members tuning in tonight, our panelists and Krista hopefully will send some recommendations for a reading list, and we'll compile that and get that to you all so you can keep reading and researching on your own. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night. Be well, everyone. Be safe. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.